Welcome to SalmonAtion 2021. This year we're virtual instead of our usual big event at Lopez Center. We're virtual because of the pandemic, of course. This would have been our 13th SalmonAtion, but we're going to come to you through the magic of digital rather than enjoying a meal together and then the slideshow afterwards, and the music, which you can put on in the background while you follow through the slideshow with me. So open a bottle of Lopez Island Vineyard's wine to accompany the slideshow and our talk about our 2020 results of salmon and forage fish research here on Lopez Island at our Watmo Bay station. Let's begin with the question of how well salmon are doing as a whole, and we'll move on to a special focus on sand lance and other forage fish and their diet and ecology here in the islands. This year we saw some improvement in the abundance of outbound juvenile Chinook salmon from Canada, from the Fraser River system, but the outmigrants from Puget Sound continue to be low, and we're increasingly concerned about this. Other researchers have noted a very low production in the Puget Sound region for the last few years. We're not exactly sure either why we've seen some increase out of the Fraser River, but this is something that we want to watch. This data is important to us because it gives us some sense of how, in the general way, our juvenile salmon are responding to trends in climate change. Our last big bulge of juvenile Chinook outmigrants was just before the blob, when we had some colder weather. Then there was the blob, high ocean temperatures, salmon numbers dropped down. We've been looking for a recovery, but actually, though the blob is gone, our waters have not gotten appreciably cooler. So we are still, in a sense, in a warming environment that is inimical to juvenile Chinook. One of the things that we've noticed about our juvenile salmon is that they are smaller than when we began in 2009. It's only been a decrease of about 10% on average, but it's pretty clearly there. We've handled thousands of fish, and this is a pretty strong number statistically. 10% decline in the size of the juvenile Chinook coming out of both Puget Sound and out of the Fraser River. This would suggest they are developing faster and leaving their stream habitats earlier than they had in the past, and this may also be a result of changing climate and changing water temperature, in particular the temperature differential between streams and salt water, where they make that decision about whether to stay or to move. Well, let's take a look at the hatchery situation. This is something that, of course, is a bit controversial. Hatcheries replace wild fish, or so-called natural production fish, and hatchery production in Western Washington has increased significantly over the years. We also see, as this slide shows, that hatchery fish are making up more and more of the total number of juvenile Chinook salmon that we see coming out of Puget Sound. Of the Canadian hatchery fish were also increasing, but Canada has made a decision to reduce its marking of its hatchery production. So for 2020, we actually aren't entirely sure how many of the little Chinook we're seeing coming out of the Fraser River system are from hatcheries or from natural production. So it's confusing at this point whether that is going up or down in terms of the outbound smolts that pass through our nets in the Salmon Islands. Now, our main interest all along has been how the Salmon Islands feed juvenile Chinook and the extent to which the islands are part of fattening them up so that they have a higher likelihood of survival at sea. The diet of juvenile Chinook, as shown as an average over the 12 years of this project in this graph in orange bars, is quite different than what we saw last summer. This is really quite strange. The red bars show you what juvenile Chinook ate in the summer of 2020 compared to the average over the 12 years of this project so far. And what you'll see is that they ate a lot less Pacific sand lance, a little bit less herring, a little bit more of some of the invertebrates. But what's striking is the significant reduction in the consumption of Pacific sand lance as part of the diet. When we began back in the late aughties, we were seeing almost 50-50 consumption of sand lance and herring, and now sand lance have really dropped. Is it because they're not there? Is it because there are more herring? This is the kind of question that scientists ask of this kind of data. So let's take a look at that a little bit more closely. This is a graph that shows you in colored bars the consumption on average per juvenile salmon of herring and of sand lance. The herring are in blue, the sand lance are in green, and you can see that up until a few years ago to 2018, sand lance consumption was going down and herring consumption was going up. And now both are down, which is very interesting. For the last 4 years, we are seeing, on average, each little juvenile salmon eating significantly less fish of either species than we had in the past. And the breaking point is the blob. It's that sudden ocean warming event that hit our area in 2017 and 18. And following that, there's this drop in consumption. Now, what's going on there, we have to investigate a little bit more closely. But one of the questions that comes out of this that we'll come back to in a few moments is whether herring and sand lance compete with each other, whether either of them is really in trouble, or whether this is something more about the behavior of the salmon themselves. So how many sand lance are actually out there? How has that changed? Well, in this graph, you can see that sand lance vary unimaginably much in abundance. In terms of how many we catch in our nets every summer, these blue bars show the variation from catching a few hundred to tens of thousands of sand lance in our nets down at Watmo Bay. In fact, this suggested to us in discussions with our colleagues at the National Marine Fisheries Service that we should change the way we graphed, the way we estimated the numbers of sand lance by just looking at how many times there were sand lance in our nets, how many times we put a net in the water and we caught at least some sand lance, instead of looking at it in terms of the total numbers we caught every summer. Because sand lance are known to school. We've seen both in the water, underwater, and in our nets that they school in unimaginable numbers. And if we just happen to hit a school, we get tens of thousands of fish. So it's a little bit more reliable statistically for us to just say, are they present or absent every time we put a net in the water? How frequently do we find sand lance in Watmo Bay? So let's take a look at that. Oh, I forgot that we should just note the years before we do that. We should note the years that we had a lot of sand lance number-wise was 2013, 2015, and 2018 were our big sand lance years. Now let's look at the presence-absence measure. You can see it sort of flattens things out. It doesn't look as much of a wild sawtooth or a mountain range as the data on total numbers. But if we look at the dates, it still shows that our peak sand lance abundance, the availability of sand lance in Watmo Bay was greatest in 2013, 15, and 18. And after that, it's gone down to about where it's been in all of the other years. That suggests that it's not the availability of sand lance in the sense of how many are out there or whether they're present or not. That's not following the same clear trend that we saw in consumption of sand lance, which is just down for the last 5 years. So let's take a look at another element of this. If there are more sand lance around, do juvenile salmon, juvenile Chinook salmon, eat more of them? If they do, then of course we should expect some relationship generally between sand lance abundance and sand lance consumption by salmon. Well, here's a plot of the abundance of sand lance, and that's the horizontal axis, against the consumption of sand lance, mean consumption per fish, the average number of sand lance eaten by each little juvenile salmon that we see. And I'm going to go and put some markers and some dates on here to show you. That's interesting because we see this is spread out. The two worst years in terms of sand lance consumption by salmon are about the same abundance as most years. So it seems pretty clear from this plot that there's no clear relationship between sand lance consumption and sand lance abundance at Watmo Bay. It's not being driven by whether sand lance are there or not. It's being driven by something else. See if we can figure that out. But before we look more at sand lance, I just want to note two other things about what we found inside our little juvenile salmon last summer in summer of 2020. Because they ate less fish, they actually ate, not surprisingly, more invertebrates to fill up their nutrient and calorie needs. If you look at this is a graph of the crustaceans eaten by juvenile Chinook each year since we began this study in 2009. And the right-hand bar shows the mix of different kinds of crustaceans that were eaten last summer in 2020. So very interesting. If you look at the orange part of that bar, that orange section is the proportion or the contribution of euphausids. Those are krill. That's just the scientific name for krill. Euphausids made up a very large part of what was eaten last summer. And that's kind of interesting because most years they haven't. So our little salmon targeted, after not eating sand lance, we're targeting a kind of crustacean that's shrimp-like and definitely nice and calorie-rich, nice and greasy and calorie-rich, that they don't often eat in any large number, and that raises other questions about whether that's because krill were particularly abundant. One thing you might just note in the back of your mind is that krill are the target for many of the filter-feeding cetaceans, whales, that we're seeing more commonly in our waters, like gray whales. The whales that are now being seen more commonly in the waters around the Salmon Islands are, for the most part, eating either herring, fish-eating whales, or they're eating krill. And so the presence of more whales in our waters also suggests that krill are more abundant than they were in the past, and they are attracting bigger predators, not just the salmon. Now let's take a look at the bugs. Well, this was really interesting. This is actually, 2020 was the second biggest year for juvenile Chinook eating insects. Now, of course, they eat insects in the streams as they are developing as little freshwater fry from egg to their first encounter with brackish water in the estuaries. So they know what bugs are good to eat. They've been eating insects for a significant part of their lives by the time they get out here to the islands in the middle of their first year of life or the beginning of their second year of life. But one of the things that was really extraordinary about this project as a whole was demonstrating over the years that juvenile Chinook salmon continue to eat insects when other things aren't available. So in late summer, The little herring and sand lance are gone. The crustaceans like crab larvae have already developed, settled. They're not readily available in the waters that our juvenile salmon are moving through. And the prey of last resort, as it were, are the bugs that fall into the sea and are drifting on the surface, frequently in large patches, and frequently bugs that have swarms, mating swarms, like ants and termites that will swarm in huge numbers, drop into the sea in huge numbers, and provide a very, very easy source of food for salmon hitting them from below. In previous years, we've often seen that midges were the largest group of insects that juvenile salmon targeted. And midges are shoreline reproducers. They lay their eggs in the seaweed and gunk that's on the shoreline and shallow pools and coastal wetlands. So it's not surprising to find a lot of midges swarming out over the water where salmon ultimately can eat them. But this year, our main source of food for our juvenile salmon from the terrestrial environment was actually bark lice or thrips, Socopterans, tiny soft-bodied insects that spend most of their lives living in the bark of trees, and they also swarm like midges and termites and ants. And this year they made up a huge part of the diet. That's the green bar that you see, or the green section on the bar on the right. So that doesn't seem like a hugely nutritious diet to be shifting from sand lance to thrips, but it is more indication that this may have been a difficult year in 2020 for our little outbound juvenile Chinook to get a full stomach and the calories they need to grow, develop, and move on out to the ocean. So let's go back to forage fish. And I'm going to start this with some of the data that we've gotten from looking for the last few years at sand lance to try to understand what might be driving the variations in their numbers, in their abundance, and their use by juvenile salmon. And then we'll take a look at the other forage fishes that sometimes co-occur with sand lance in places like Watmo Bay, particularly herring and smelt. And all three of these forage fishes are important to at least some marine organisms, to marine mammals, to birds, and at least herring and smelt have been important to people as well. So it'll be important for us to see, after we take a closer look at sand lance, whether sand lance are specialists, they have their own niche in terms of what they need to eat in order to grow and prosper, or whether they overlap with and compete with other forage fishes, so that to some extent when one thrives, the others may have difficulty finding enough to eat, and there may be some negative feedback to other forage fish species of big reproductive events like we saw for herring last year in 2020, and the prey available to feed other forage fishes whose diets overlap. So sand lance. Well, first of all, it's useful to bear in mind that sand lance tend to congregate as groups of schools, aggregations of schools of fish in Watmo Bay in the summer months. And this is a graph of the years in which we saw them in different months at Watmo Bay. And so they stack up to give you a peak presence. Most likely presence, most frequent presence in Watmo Bay is in July, and we don't really see them in Watmo Bay except a few stragglers outside of the range of May to September, so that they are basically summer visitors, but in very large numbers, and that may affect what they are able to find to eat. So now let's shift to to that side. What do they eat when they're at Watmo? We have been dissecting sand lance, looking at their gut contents for several years now. It needs to be under the microscope because the stomach of a sand lance is about the size of a matchstick. So it's a very, very tiny stomach with very, very tiny prey items inside. But reconstructing from hundreds of sand lance, we have a pie graph here of the average diet over several years of study. The light orange that makes up most of the pie, more than half of the pie, are small Calendoid Copepods, small crustaceans, about a half a millimeter. These are really, really tiny, but filled with orange, waxy oil, very calorie dense. And so despite their small size, they are not only rich in calories, but they can be enormously abundant. At some times of the year, 90% of what's in the zooplankton, 90% of the zooplankters in the water around the islands are small Calendoid Copepods. 90% of all the zooplankton sometimes of year are small Calendoid. So it makes sense. They're certainly abundant and a rich food, but they're very tiny, and that's a lot of work. The larger Calendoid Copepods, and there are just a few species in our waters, that's the red pie slice in here. They can be up to half a centimeter. That's to say, well, about that much. They can be quite large. They also are rich in calories, but they are about 12 to 16 times more massive per copepod. So if you can find them, they're a much better bet for efficient feeding. And our evidence now is that sand lance don't just open their mouths and vacuum up whatever is in front of them in the zooplankton, but like chickens, they peck, except they peck upwards on the sea surface, and they're pecking out these larger Calendoid Copepods. I'll show you in a moment some data that confirms that they're being highly selective for the big ones. So the red is the big Calendoid Copepods. I should call them large copepods. And then larvaceans, that's the gray. Larvaceans are pelagic, free-swimming sea squirts, tunicates or ascidians. They're really weird. They're gelatinous, but they are distant relatives of us because they have a primitive central nervous system, a notochord, and they have a little tail like a tadpole that this primitive nervous system can power, can guide, so that they have some swimming motion that is lost in the ascidians or sea squirts that, like barnacles, become sessile, attached to rocks or some substrate later in life. So larvaceans, free-swimming little primitive urochordates that are gelatinous blobs of protein, and at some times of year, they tend to be here in the late summer and early fall, sometimes of year they swarm in our waters, they form big clouds, and we have found that that's one of the things that sand lance really like to eat, just pure protein blobs. So copepods, larvaceans, that's now we're already up to about 5/6 of the total diet of these things. The major other component of the diet that we are seeing, which is a green pie slice in here, is diatoms, plants, algae. A diatom is just an algal cell, a single cell that's photosynthetic and lives in a glass house, in a case, a porous glass case, which protects it from predators, at least small predators, not one as big as a sand lance, but also weigh it down so that diatoms will reproduce rapidly when there's plenty of nutrients, plenty of sunlight, nice warm water. They will reproduce massively, produce enormous blooms, and then they start to settle so that the bloom basically just settles and dies, and they have a very short lifespan determined by how buoyant they can maintain themselves during the period of time that they grow and reproduce. But the largest diatoms are about the same size as the smallest copepods. And what we have seen is that sand lance will shift to eating a substantial proportion of diatoms, at least the large ones, when they are available, and other things might not be. So our sand lance are omnivorous. They prefer to eat crustaceans. They prefer their, as it were, like their crab salad, but they really can also subsist on a significant proportion of plants. Okay, now let's talk about how selective they are. Now, this is a basic issue in trophic ecology. We see things in the stomachs of animals, and do they choose to eat these things? Are they just blindly eating whatever is available, purely opportunistic? Do they go out and look for particular kinds of prey that can be caught easily or that are particularly rich in calories? This question of selectivity, prey choice, or opportunism is fundamental to understanding the interaction of predators with their environment. And the basic standard for exploring that is to compare the availability of prey in the environment, what we call the prey field, with actual prey utilization. What was there, what was used. And that's the way the graphs that you see now were set up. The left-hand bar, the left-hand column, is what was there, the prey field. The right-hand bar is what sand lance actually ate. And this is something that we graph day by day. We can also do it aggregated, averaged out over a year, but it's most stunning when we look at a very specific slice of time, a few hours at Watmo Bay, and compare what we found in our plankton nets with what sand lance had in their stomachs from their last meal. Well, if you look at this graph, there were two dates, 2 years ago in 2019, 15 July and 26 September. And if you look from the left bar, which is prey availability, the prey field, to the right bar, what sand lance ate, you'll see something very striking right away. That red bar, that red section, is really, really big in terms of prey use. And that's the same color key we had in the pie graph. That red bar, red section, is the large copepods. So if you look at these, you quickly see that on those two dates, sand lance had made a significant effort to pick out, or I should say, to peck out the larger copepods, and had in their stomachs a much larger proportion of larger copepods than were in the water. So that comparison tells us that they were making an effort. They simply opened their mouths and plowed through like we imagine a shark or a kind of a marine vacuum cleaner. If they just opened their mouths and sucked up what was there, what was in their stomach should look pretty much like what the prey field was. But no, we see that focus on larger copepods, and the second focus you notice in there is the gray bar. That's the Larvaceans. So we see that out of what was available on those two dates as examples, our sand lance in Watmo Bay tried to get as many larger copepods and Larvaceans as they could, and then what else they ate was what was most available, what was most common. That was the small copepods and the diatoms. But those large copepods probably are what makes a difference in the quality of the diet that sand lance eat. So when are they available, and how much do they vary from year to year? Okay, now this is, at first, it looks like hash. and in fact, that's the point. This is a graph showing for each month of the year how many years we saw big copepods as part of the prey field. So each year here is represented by a differently colored bar, so you can tell the years apart, and they're lined up by season. So let me explain. If you look at this, you'll see, for example, in the middle, a tall green bar. The green is 2016, and that means that in late June of 2016, there were a lot of big copepods in the water. You'll see further to the right a couple of tall orange bars. That's 2015. We also had big copepods in the water, lots of them, but later in August and September. If you look at this then, you can see that there's no clear seasonal pattern. The availability, the abundance around Watmo Bay of the larger copepods is not really predictable to any season. It's somewhere in the summer. But it could be early in the summer, it could be late in the summer, it could happen 2 or 3 times, it could be a lot, it could be a little. Over these years, we see no particular predictable juncture when a sand lance could go to Watmo Bay and be sure that we'll find lots of what it most likes to eat. That means that it's challenging for sand lance to meet up with the best prey items for them for growth and survival. And it also suggests, because it's jumping around during the summer, that this may be something that's very sensitive to changes from year to year in weather patterns. Well, let's move on to the bigger picture. If we think about this as a game that's played every year between sand lance and their prey, how well do they do from year to year in the aggregate, not just looking at individual dates, but at the whole year? So here we have a comparison of what our sand lance in Watmo Bay ate in 2018 and right-hand bar, right-hand column, 2019. So this is just looking at the actual prey use in 2 years. Look at the red and gray bars, knowing again that those are the big copepods and the larvaceans that sand lance tend to target. There's a big difference here between these 2 years. And also notice that the columns are different height. This is total numbers eaten on average per fish. So the 2019, the column's a little bit smaller. That means that the total number of things, of prey items, on average in the stomach of each sand lance were fewer. But if you look at this, that fewer was richer, red and gray, richer in large copepods and larvaceans. In other words, they ate fewer things on average in 2019, but they ate better things, bigger, more calorie rich than they ate the year before, which would be really interesting just in itself, meaning that they had an opportunity to eat better quality in 2019. But there's another element to this that makes it a really important finding, and that is that there were fewer sand lance in Watmo Bay in 2019. So there was an association between there being fewer sand lance that summer and they ate better in terms of eating more of the higher value prey items that they seem to prefer. The inference from this is that there might not be enough high value prey to feed a large population of sand lance, what an ecologist would call prey limitation, or a bottom-up regulation of the number of sand lance. That when we reduce the number of sand lance, they all eat better. If we increase the number, they all eat more poorly. That suggests there's not enough of the best quality prey to go around, which suggests in turn that something may be changing in our waters that is depriving sand lance of the kind of prey field that would enable them to maintain their historic abundance. We have to investigate this further, but this is really an important insight into what may be going on and why salmon are getting fewer sand lands to eat. This is another way of looking at the same thing. What I did here in this graph is the same thing. We're comparing what sand lands ate in 2018 with what they ate in 2019. And what we see here is an adjustment. I've adjusted the numbers to reflect calories, or more specifically, biomass. These are all very similar organisms. So we just are multiplying things out for the bigger items. A 5 millimeter long copepod is 5 times bigger, at least 5 times longer than a 1 millimeter copepod. So we've just crudely worked this out to give some sense of how the quality of the diet in 2018 and 2019 can be adjusted to reflect the size of the prey items. So the little one is not the same as a big one. We count more for the big ones. Now these two columns are really different in size. And the 2019 one now, instead of being lower, is much higher. That's another way of confirming that while in 2019 sand lands ate fewer things, they ate better because they actually ate more biomass than they did per fish in 2018. Very important. Again, suggesting some kind of bottom-up regulation of sand lands populations. Well, now let's move to yet another level, which is how this fits into forage fishes generally. We know from all these years of monitoring juvenile Chinook that juvenile Chinook mostly eat herring and sand lands. 80–85% of the biomass that goes in their mouths while they're here in the islands is one or the other of these two species of fish. So what about sand lance and herring? Do herring eat the kinds of things that sand lance eat, so that they would be interchangeable ecologically with sand lands? Not just interchangeable in terms of the willingness of salmon, or let's say the interest of salmon in eating them, but are they interchangeable ecologically in terms of what they eat? And then we threw in smelt, because smelt are important economically and as food on Lopez for humans, and are also regulated and also in our waters, and that basically are the third forage fish that we encounter at Watmo and elsewhere around the island. Let's see if they fit into this in some way, as well as herring and sand lance. So those are the three columns. We have sand lance. This is all adjusted to 100%. Each column goes to 100%. So we're comparing proportions of the diet for three species. In 2020, this is new data that we developed over the last 6 months, and looks at the aggregate average for all of the individual fish that we dissected. Sand lance, what do you see? On the whole, they ate a lot of large copepods. This is what we already know. Disproportionately large number of big copepods and larvaceans, the red section and the gray section. Look at herring. No, they ate some big copepods too, not as many, and they ate a lot of larvaceans. So already just looking at this, you can see that where sand lance are sensitive to prey availability, there is overlap. Doesn't look huge here, but there is overlap both with large copepods and larvaceans with the diet of herring. And then the smelt. Well, the smelt are weird because they eat little copepods, but it looks like everything eats little copepods because they're everywhere for much of the year. So they are similar to herring and sand lance in eating a lot of these little tiny copepods, but beyond that, it looks like a whole different world. And in fact, as we continue to do our study of smelt, we're seeing that smelt differ not only in what they eat, but even where they hunt. We see evidence that sand lance, which rest in the sand, buried in the sand at night, come up to the surface during the daytime and are eating on the surface, and then go back down and digest at night the way we do. That herring are always eating day and night, moving up and down the water column, but spending most of their foraging time near the top. And of course, how do we know this? We look at what they ate and where the things they ate tend to hang out in the water column. Smelt, we find, are much more likely to spend time on the bottom, eating what's on the bottom or close to the bottom. So they are more diverse in what they eat. They tend to eat more benthic or bottom-living organisms like worms, and they have less overlap with the diet of herring and sand lance. Very, very interesting that smelt may live a rather different life, whereas herring and sand lance are connected to some extent through diet. Let's look a little more closely at that. So here we go again. We're going to look at a single day where we can compare what sand lance ate and what herring ate on that day with the prey field, with what was in the water that could be eaten. So prey field on the left, then sand lance utilization of that prey field, and then the right-hand column is the herring. So what do we see? Well, one thing you see is that what was in the water, largely orange bar, small copepods, green bar, big diatoms. Okay, and herring and sand lance did eat little small copepods and diatoms. But where the interesting selectivity came in, where their targeting or focus came in, is that both sand lance and herring disproportionately ate large copepods, red bar, and larvaceans. So on this day, herring and sand lance were directly competing for prey. They were both selecting for animals that were in very scarce supply in the prey field, but that they preferred, they went after, they ate disproportionately, and they were competing directly with each other for both of those prey items, larvaceans and larger copepods. That's interesting. So this is an example on one date where the herring and the sand lance in Watmo Bay were trying to eat the same things. And that sets up the possibility that they were in competition, not just in the sense that there was overlap in their diet, but that a larvation eaten by a herring was perhaps not available to be eaten by one of the sand lance. Here's a different date and a somewhat different pattern. Incidentally, I should clarify that in that first slide we looked at just before, the herring and the sand lance also were the same size. That's something we need to control for, because if there's too big a difference in size, we might not expect them to compete, even if at the same size they would compete. So we're always paying attention to size relationships. And here again in this slide, which is for June 19th last summer, the herring and the sand lance were both on average 109 millimeters long. So they averaged out to exactly the same size, but they didn't eat the same thing. And if you look again, prey field, almost all that was in the water was small copepods, the orange. It was just chock-a-block with small copepods. But the sand lance went after large copepods. Somehow they found them. And they also ate, and this is the purple in there, which is a new color for us, they also ate a lot of hyperid amphipods, which are little pelagic, they are related to sand fleas, which are gammarid amphipods, but hyperids, if you are not familiar with them, are little swimmers. They have big eyes, and they are active in the upper part of the water column, feeding on the plankton. So This is something that fish would get feeding near the surface, and as you can see from the prey field bar, there weren't proportionally an awful lot of hyperiid amphipods in the water on that date, but both the sand lance and the herring targeted hyperiid amphipods. And then there's a difference, which is interesting. The sand lance went a little more for the large copepods. The herring went a little bit more for the hyperiid amphipods. So there was overlap in their diet. They both went for both of these species, but they differed a little bit in which one they were more focused on, which suggests that this is a matter of context. The size of the forage fish and the availability of different prey. Still, however, this is an example where herring and sand lance in principle were in competition because they were mostly eating the same things, neither of which was very abundant at the time. They were both targeting the same scarce prey items. If we change this to a date when we had a difference in size, we see more of a difference between herring and sand lance. So here, if you look at the sand lance bar, it's got a number down at the bottom, 105 millimeters. So these are sand lance that are about that big, and the herring were about 10% bigger. And with big sand lance and slightly bigger herring, the difference in their diets increased. So the sand lance, as you can see here, the red, expectedly, this is very sand lance, really focused on the larger copepods, and the herring focused on the amphipods. So what we saw in the previous slide, where they both were interested in large copepods and amphipods, but in different proportions, now as their sizes move apart, the size relationship moves apart, we see that difference in prey choice exacerbated, if I could put it that way, with the herring being much more interested in hyperids and the sand lance sticking with their large copepods. So this is beginning to suggest how we could model the way in which size and prey availability translate into prey choice between these two forage fishes. And here's one last one to wrap this up, as it were. Now we're going the opposite direction, where we have herring and sand lance together in Watmo Bay at the same time, and it's the herring that are smaller. They're little young of the year herring. They look to me like quarters, little silvery fish about that big, against sand lance that are 80 millimeters, which is about almost a third again as large. So bigger sand lance, smaller herring, and we see in that case there's overlap, plenty of overlap on this particular date. Mostly larvaceans. There seemed to have been, this was a date when sand lance were really interested in the larvaceans. That's the gray. They stuffed on larvaceans. The little herring also stuffed on larvaceans, but they ate a higher proportion of what was just there, which was diatoms and small copepods. So their diets again overlapped, and they overlapped more than they did when the herring were bigger and sand lance smaller. So again, these are clues as to how, I don't want to be misleading by saying how fish think, but how they respond given their size and the season and what's available, how they respond to what prey they can choose to peck at. And it's very clear that within certain size limits and certain relationships of size, herring and sand lance do pursue the same relatively scarce prey. So what have we learned up to this point? Well, what we've learned is that, first of all, sand lance do best, as we saw in comparing 2018 and 2019, when there were fewer sand lance, more large copepods available to them, and they can eat lots of large copepods. The biomass they eat on average is much greater when they are able to find more large copepods, and that seems to be when there are fewer of them searching for them. Sand lance and juvenile herring, and I should note that the herring that are swimming, herring grow a lot faster to a lot larger size, so it's at a certain point in their life history when they're in this kind of comparable size range that we've been looking at. But sand lance and these little juvenile herring that we see most years do compete for some high value prey, large copepods and amphipods sometimes, and certainly larvaceans are targeted by both species, and often are targeted by both species when they're in the same place at the same time and these prey are scarce, which sets up the possibility that they may not be equally capable of getting what they want to eat. This becomes the interesting question. If you have lions and tigers and they both like to eat antelope, do they end up with a 50-50 split of the antelope, or do the tigers get more of them and the lions fewer? This is something about animal behavior in foraging, in hunting, that we have not explored previously. This is new science that we've not explored in forage fishes, and the data that we have now is suggesting that we need to understand how the prey that are available get divided up between forage fish species when they're all going after the same prey. And from that, we can anticipate how changes in the availability of prey, which is all being driven by climate in the background, is going to affect the abundance of herring and sand lance, and consequently what's available for Chinook. And that will be along the lines of, depending upon how they behave when they're in the same place at the same time, are either herring or sand lance prey limited. That is to say, they can't grow faster or become more abundant because they can't get enough to eat, which would be the kind of thing that would be a very important factor for fishery managers to take into account as they not only try to manage what we have, but they try to increase or augment what we have through habitat or other kinds of conservation measures, active conservation measures. Well, as usual, as I tend to say every year, this is the work of a cast of thousands, our volunteers who were cut back sadly because of the pandemic, and we proceeded this year under an agreement with the state that we would stick to small bubbles of volunteers. So unfortunately, many of you who are hearing this probably intended to be on the beach with us, but weren't able to because of our pandemic agreement with the state of Washington. Our lab team, our apprentices this summer who filled in critically in getting nets pulled in and fish counted, and of course our partners at DFW and the University of Washington who help us determine what the prey field is when we go out to do our salmon seining, and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Southern Resident Killer Whale Fund, which is paying for our exploration of competition between forage fishes. Well, we hope that things will be good for having more togetherness on the beach in 2021. We hope to see you on the beach. We hope it'll be safe to be on the beach together in the summer ahead, so that more of you can participate directly in this work and rejoin our effort, which is now becoming even more important and more fascinating as our climate continues to change and we begin to understand a little bit better the behavioral interactions of salmon and forage fishes at a level that has not previously been investigated.